So for those of you who missed it, but we talked a lot about design in the universe. We laid a foundation out. I talked about fingerprints that God has left all throughout creation, whether it's on a macro or a micro level. And we talked a little bit about the scientific revolution and just the importance of what scientists saw during that time, how they searched the cosmos and how they searched humanity and saw order and design in things because of a designer. We talked about, well, why science? Why does it matter? I actually had a great question last week. Someone asked me, well, Danny, do we really need science? Well, why does science matter? And my response to that is well, it's very similar to how we worship God. Can we worship God through hearing the word, through fellowship with fellow believers? Absolutely. But when we worship the Lord through song and through singing, it's a completely different aspect of worship to the Lord that we don't get in any other way. So similar to how when we study science, we're able to see God in a completely different light and see how he has created everything and designed it in a certain way and is really all powerful. So I talked a little bit about how science and faith, how it's often viewed as they're at odds with each other, but in reality, it's really more like a puzzle that works together to give a clear vision of just the greatness of our God. Talked about Lewis's quote and how people became scientific because they knew that God was around. We looked at the integration model, which was more natural theology, that God, he creates or he inspires his word, and we get nature and we get scripture, and then we have human interpretation, and that's where we get theology, and that's where we get science. And that these two have to harmonize. And so if there's some issue there, it's with human interpretation. Talked about what is it that drives scientific conclusions, that we should receive data, we should interpret it as such, and then come to conclusions. For example, the existence of the universe. We see its creation. Well, is there maybe design? Is there reverse engineer it and see, oh, well, we do have a beginning, which we'll talk about here in a bit. But really where we're at right now is that in order for something to be considered scientific, it has to go through this naturalistic filter. That unless it is something that we can see and touch and measure here, then if it's not that, then it's not scientific. And so really this idea to get away from God. Whew, quick review. Now, we are back here. Start really easy, okay? Back in the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, okay? That's pretty simple enough to wrap our heads around. So today what we're going to do is just go through, first of all, the fine-tuning of the universe, and then we're going to talk about how the universe had a beginning and why I think that that's just such an amazing thing to understand from a scientific perspective that we can present to people so that they can get them thinking. There's a book called Tactics I recommended a few weeks ago, and sometimes when we're evangelizing, we try to seal the deal like, hey, do you know Jesus? And if you don't, let me tell you why you need to know Jesus. That's awesome. But sometimes that's not always the most effective way that we evangelize long-term to people. Sometimes it's all about throwing a little pebble in their shoes and then just feeling a little uncomfortable, like, ooh, what is that? Ooh, ooh, ooh. Well, hey, there's a beginning to the universe. Oh, really? That makes me feel uncomfortable because there's some questions. Well, there's a beginning, then what began it? But I'm jumping ahead here. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So we're going to go over 6, and I wrote them down here because they're a little bit wordy and hard to explain, but I hope that you can just read them off there. So there's some fundamental forces that are necessary for life to exist. Some of them are gravity. There is strong and weak nuclear force, and there is electromagnetic force. And now these are the 6 most commonly cited fine-tuning parameters, and that if any of these were slightly off 1 degree or to the other degree, then life as we know it would not exist, or the universe itself would not exist. So let's just go over these real quick. Strong nuclear force. So this is a force that's responsible for binding the protons and neutrons together in an atom. And so if this were slightly stronger or slightly weaker than it currently is, then it would be impossible for some of the heavier elements that are necessary for life to form. Okay, that's the first one. The next one is electromagnetic force, and this is what holds these things together. It's responsible for holding atoms and molecules together. Now, if the strength of that were slightly different, then chemical bonding would not be possible for life to exist, okay? So if that would change to one way or the other, then it wouldn't exist, okay? Weak nuclear force. This is what's responsible for radioactive decay, and it's essential for the formation of heavy elements that make stars, and so like our sun, we need the sun to live. If that were slightly off, one way or the other, then again, life would not be possible. Now, something that maybe most of us can understand a little bit better, gravity. We all understand gravity. What goes up must come? Excellent. All right, so gravity, if that were altered one way or another, if the strength, if its strength were the gravitational force between the objects were changed ever so slightly, then the universe would either expand much too quickly for stars and galaxies to form, or if it were a little bit weaker, then it would have started to go, and then it would just collapsed, and that's what's the big crunch, so life wouldn't have existed. There's the cosmological constant, which we'll come back to in a sec. I need that for later. Cosmological constant. Now, this is the expansion rate, so how fast something's going. So the last one we talked about is gravity. That's how strong it is. The next one, this one, is how fast it is. So if the expansion rate of the universe were any different, if it were slightly quicker, again, stars and galaxies wouldn't have formed. If it were any slower, again, it would have gone, and then big squish, big crunch. And then this next one is sometimes referred to as the God particle. It's a Higgs boson. So this is what gives particles mass. And so if the mass of the Higgs boson was slightly different one way or the other, then it would be impossible for other particles to have any other mass. Now these are some of the 6 biggest arguments that are used for the fine-tuning of the universe. And it's God's fingerprints on this, but I want to take you something. So a lot of this stuff, for me, this is stuff that I've been learning over the last year. And some of it's still like way up here for me to understand, but I wanted to kind of bring it down to something that everyone can understand. Oop. Making sure you're awake here. Okay, I think we should be good. I think I move around too much. I get too excited. Science excites me. So, sand. We all understand sand, right? Has everyone touched sand before? Yeah, okay. I was going to bring sand, but then I'm prone to accidents, and I was worried I was going to spill it all over, and Doreen would have gotten upset. So, sand. So sand is amazing, but 1 grain of sand, can anyone take a guess of how many atoms are approximately in 1 grain of sand? Just yell it out. Anyone? Yeah. What's the biggest number you can think of? 4 million atoms. Anyone else? Yeah. 600 atoms. It is actually more than 600, and it's more than 4 million. It's actually 43 quadrillion, give or take a quadrillion. Now some of you are like, wow, that's a cool sounding number. What does that even mean? Well, let me just kind of put it into perspective for you. So we've got a million, we've got a billion, we've got a trillion, we've got a quadrillion. Oh, sorry, I think I misspoke. It's not a quadrillion, it's a quintillion, a 43 quintillion. So now if you were to try to count to the number 43 quintillion, can anyone guess how long it would take you to count to that number? 2 million years. Not quite. It would actually take you 1.37 billion years to count to the number 43 quadrillion. And that's about the number of atoms that are in a single grain of sand. Wow. Like that's kind of amazing. Let me give you some other fun facts here. If the moon were slightly larger, the gravitational pull would be higher, and it would cause just big tidal waves to engulf all the land. If the Earth has anyone seen Star Wars before? You know how some of the planets have 2 moons? Well, if that was us, then the tides would actually be unstable, and life, as we know it, would not be sustainable. Now, you guys have probably heard this one. If the Earth were a little bit more closer to the sun, it would be too hot. If it were further away, it would be too cold. It would probably be like Linden, or too hot would be like Texas. So our solar system, it's also in this like really, I call it the Goldilocks zone. I think that's a pretty accurate way to describe it. It's not too hot, not too cold, not in this unsustainable place, but it's between these spiral arms, so there's a lot less like crazy chaos that's going on. It's not too close to the center so that we're just getting bombarded with all this stuff. It's in a perfect area. Now I need someone who, I left my wallet, but I'm good on my word. Who wants to make $20? Does anyone? Yeah? Okay, come here. I need your help. Okay. I need you to hold this coin. No, this is probably different than, this is a peso, so it's probably worth a whole 11 cents. There's 2 pesos, so this is tails and this is heads. I need you to flip that for me, and if you can hit 10 times heads in a row, I'll give you $20. Okay, go for it, okay? Is that heads or tails?
It says the 2.
The number 2, that is tails, so you've already lost. I'll give you one more try. I'll give you one more try. Another because I'm really nice and because you're Pastor Sean's son and I want to get brownie points with him. So go ahead and flip it one more time. I'll give you one more chance. Oh, that's another tails. Man, this is rigged. You would have gotten 3. Here, just for funsies, do it one more. I want to see if you're going to get another tails. Maybe I should have flipped it reverse. You could have done heads. Okay, keep going. That's actually 5. Okay, we're going to see. I might be out $20 here. Okay, that's 6. Go. That's 7. Okay, keep going. I'm going to lose $20 here. Okay, that's 8. Okay, keep going. 2 more. Man, I got the wrong peso here. Hey, good try. Give him a round of applause. All right. What does that have to do with science? I want to go back to a concept that I talked about a little bit earlier called the cosmological constant. Now, this is the rate of expansion at which the universe goes and how fast it expands within space and time. If it was too fast, we wouldn't have had stars or galaxies. If it was too slow, everything would have just crunched back together. You almost had me there. Almost had me. I was kind of sweating a little bit. But in order for this to happen, for the expansion rate to be exactly what it is, it would have to be, it's 10 to the power of 120, which is, it's a big number, to 1. That's the chances of that happening. So that's the statistical probability for that happening, and that's the equivalent of taking a coin, like what you just did, flipping it and getting heads or tails, I guess this time, 400 times in a row. Which is basically impossible. Is it probable? Sure, but it's a probability that's like not even close to anything that we would deem like. I wouldn't bet on those odds, if that makes sense. Like I would here. I almost lost. See, that's why you don't gamble. So, Hugh Ross is an astrophysicist and really a smart guy. I love the stuff he does, but he has this book which I highly recommend. The Creator and the Cosmos. So in it, if you're a little bit more interested in specifics of the fine-tuning argument and different points, he's got over 100 different points in his appendix, just about the fine-tuning of the universe and everything. But in it, he says this. He says, if the universe is created, there must be reality beyond the universe. The Creator is a source of life and establishes its meaning and purpose. To study the origin and development of the universe is, in a sense, to investigate the basis of any meaning and purpose of life. Cosmology has a deep theological and philosophical ramifications, and this is absolutely true. If this is true, which it is, if there is such a small degree to which if this cosmological constant were slightly different in any way, shape, or form, we wouldn't even exist, then it does lead to theological and philosophical questions. So I'm going to play a quick video here, and then we will come back and chat.
So if we go back to this analogy, look, I knew when I walked up to this scene that this was tampered with. I wasn't just going to walk away and say, oh, well, bad accident. I knew based on the conditions that this was no accident. Make sense? In a similar way, we have a condition here that we cannot just write off as an accident. We've got both a foundational level, a unique backstory. We have a regional level of the galaxies, which is hard to ignore. And finally, we have this locational level of all these tampered, all these little... Let me show you how crazy it is. I cannot collect and list for you all of the universal constants that have to be just so in order for us to be sitting here right now listening to this. But I can kind of illustrate it this way. If you were in a cockpit of a spaceship, okay, there are a number of things that have to be just so in order for you to get to the specific destination. These are all like the constants we see in the universe that have to be finely tuned just so. All of these things have to be, if any one of these things is off by a degree in one direction or the other, you don't get to your destination. Now, you know, if you were to see a cockpit like this, you know that if you set this correctly so you can end up someplace really far away accurately, it's not an accident. It's that somebody has set all of these dials specifically to get you where you need to go. It's not an accident. And it turns out the universe is just like that. All of these coordinates have been set within a fraction to get us where we need to go, which is to a planet like ours, and more importantly, a planet in which life like ours can emerge. Does that make sense? This is why Paul Davies, who's not a believer, he's a physicist and a scientist at Arizona State University, he puts it this way: everyone agrees that the universe at least looks as if it has been designed for life. Everyone agrees on that. So how do you explain the appearance of fine-tuning? Well, it could just be there's a fine-tuner.
Yeah, that's a pretty good conclusion he comes to. You know, how do you explain fine-tuning? Well, it could just be that there really is just a fine-tuner. So I want to move on a little bit to something we've seen kind of at a macro level, this big, you know, the universe could not exist if this was not the way it was. But I want to take it to kind of a smaller level and something that is pretty amazing, and that's with the formation of children, babies. That one cell becomes 2 cells, becomes 4, 8, 16, 32, etc., and then becomes us. I want to show you a really cool baby picture, and you know I have to, and I know, aren't my children cute? That's, you know, yeah, so it's okay to say, yeah. I think one of the most fascinating things about the development of a baby is the nervous system. And how is it that that a brain is developed, and then even something that science can't explain is consciousness. How do we become conscious, and where does our thoughts and our mind come from and reside? You know, I love dogs, but a golden retriever is not going to sit there and contemplate the meaning of life. Why do we do that? I would assert that that's because we're created in the image of God. And here's a quote I want to read to you just about the development of the brain. It says, at the peak of brain development, millions of neural cells are produced per minute, and they must migrate to specific regions of the brain and differentiate into specialized types of cells. So how is it that there are all these, that during the formation of the nervous system and the brain, that all these cells, they migrate to the specific place, and then they go from there? How do they know that? Who tells them to do that? And how is it that this can become this? Yeah, that's my kids. And I was thinking about this earlier. And I'm a long ways from this, but I'm like, when I'm a grandpa, I'm going to be one of those grandpas that would just, in any conversation, we could be talking about like the rain and donuts. Oh wow, that's really good. Have you seen a picture of my grandkids? And that's going to be me. So. So I think it's fascinating. Life is amazing, and the way that we as human beings are developed is astounding. I want to introduce you to Sophia here. So I've got another video I'm going to show here, and we'll come back here.
This is Olivia. Though she has yet to greet the outside world, she has already completed an amazing journey. This is the moment that life begins. A new human being has come into existence. At fertilization, her gender, ethnicity, hair color, eye color, and countless traits are already determined. She begins to implant in the uterus about 1 week after fertilization. Her cells organize into what we call an embryo. At 3 weeks and 1 day, just 22 days after fertilization, Olivia's heartbeat can be detected. The buds of her arms and legs appear by 4 weeks. She begins to move between 5 and 6 weeks with both spontaneous and reflexive movements. At 6 weeks from fertilization, her brain activity can be recorded, and bone formation begins. She can bring her hands together at 7.5 weeks, and separate fingers and toes emerge. She can also begin to hiccup. At the beginning of the 9th week, Olivia will have grown from a single cell into nearly 1 billion cells, and she is now called a fetus. She will suck her thumb and swallow, grasp an object, touch her face, sigh and stretch. At 11 weeks, she is playing in the womb, moving her body and exploring her environment. Her taste bud cells have matured by week 12 but are still scattered throughout her mouth. Her mother will first sense Olivia's movements between 14 and 18 weeks, an event called quickening. Beginning at 18 weeks, ultrasounds show speaking movements in her voice box. Around 20 weeks, with a lot of help, babies have survived outside the womb. At 27 weeks, her eyes are responding to light. She can recognize her parents' voices and will even recognize lullabies and stories. Olivia has gone on an amazing journey during these last 9 months. She will soon signal to her mother that it is time for delivery and greet the outside world.
Isn't that incredible? It's just like wow. Like we are so privileged to be able to see something like that. I talked about how in the scientific revolution, it was only plus or minus 400 years, and the fact that we can see all these great and wonderful things, that the heavens declare the glory of God, is amazing. And people could see that before, but we can see it in an even further way. And for us now to be able to see things like this, to see how the formation of a baby is just from a single cell and just expanded. Have any of you guys, have any of you seen ultrasounds before? The baby? Have any of you seen like a 4D model? We had a chance to do that with our kids, and it is the coolest thing to see in real time. You see the shape of the baby, and they're moving, and the little hiccup, and you're just like, that's the cutest thing. And it's like, they're just hiccuping. But it's awesome because it's like a baby, and it's inside, and you can see it. So anyways, from this macro level, we see that the probability for something like this to form is it shouldn't happen, but we see this. We see fingerprints, evidence of design. Now, what is it that forms a baby? What makes up all of us? There's scaffolding, there's blueprints that have already been pre-laid out. It's called your DNA. And I mentioned a comment last time how in one cell of our DNA there's enough data to hold 500,000 movies. Do you know how many movies have more or less been produced in the entire span of movies being around? About 500,000. So if you could watch every single movie that has ever been created, that would be enough to just be stored in one single cell of your DNA. And there's many cells of DNA. So I want to show you one more video here, and then we'll move on to our second point here. It's on DNA. So this is by Stephen Meyer, and he wrote a book on this. So
one of the arguments I made near the end of the book was not just about the basics of molecular biology, the fact that you've got DNA with information-rich sequences that codes for the building of proteins, but also about new things we're learning about what computer scientists call the design patterns that are at work in the information processing system of the cell. We have one of the Microsoft Elite programmers who has worked with our lab. He was writing some software, 10,000 lines of code, to help simulate what's called the gene expression system, how the information in DNA directs the construction of proteins. And one day he walked into my office and he threw a book down on my table called Design Patterns. It's a standard design manual for computer software engineers. And he said somewhat melodramatically, especially for a computer science guy, he says, I get an eerie feeling. He says that someone's figured this out before us. And I said, what do you mean? And he explains, well, I'm writing all this code to try to simulate not just the fact that DNA has information, which he says I know is what is the bee in your bonnet, Steve, but it's not just the information, it's how the cell is processing the information. It's using all the same design patterns, and then he explained that's a term of art, design strategies or a design logic. It's using all the same design strategies that we use in modern digital computing. There's a automated error correction in the cell. We have spell check. We have files within folders, folders within superfolders, superfolders within superduper folders, a hierarchical filing system on the desktop but that's also what the cell uses to organize the information that it has on the chromosomes. And he explained how there's nested coding of information, messages encoded in other messages, an advanced technique used in cryptography. And he's finding all this sophisticated design logic in the way that the cell processes information. And so in the book, I actually describe this, but we've been learning more and more about this, even in very recent years. One thing that's come out is that the so-called junk DNA, the parts of the DNA that don't code for building proteins, is no longer thought to be junk at all. It's information, and it's performing a very sophisticated function. It is essentially functioning like an operating system that is timing the expression of the data files, the parts of the DNA that code for proteins. So the more we learn about the cell, the more we learn that it's a hierarchically arranged system of information that is mind-blowing in its complexity.
Our DNA is absolutely mind-blowing and complex. One of the things that they mentioned in there, it's funny that this computer programmer says, I have this eerie feeling that someone's already done this before. And it's like, yeah, they have, and it's God. And so we see that he just has designed our DNA in such a way that there's code that's inputted. Information always comes from a source. This lecture that I'm doing here now, I've pulled it from various sources of information and given it back to you. It's all sourced in something. And there's code that needs to be put in, and this code is certainly a signature from God that he's given us here. And this is something that the human genome we talked about Collins last week and how he's mapped it out. It's a very recent discovery. But I want to switch over to the second point on your back page, and I think for me, this is probably the best argument that I would use against someone who is doubting if God exists or not. I think you can use this in conjunction with some of the other things, and I'll explain that here in a little bit. But it is the fact that the universe has a beginning. Because you can talk about design and everything, and you can say, well, that's just a process of natural selection, and of course it's that way because if it wasn't that way, then we wouldn't be here to observe it, so it has to be that way, which is kind of a silly argument in my opinion. But I think that this is a good point to go to, that the universe indeed does have a beginning. We read it in Genesis, but more recently, within the last 100 years, in 1920, Edwin Hubble, he got access to this large dome telescope. Now, before you had telescopes, and you could look up and you'd see a white point in the dot, and you'd say, that's probably a star. Before we used to, we now know that there's a lot of galaxies out there, like a lot of galaxies. But 100 and change years ago, that wasn't the case. We're wrestling with the questions of, are we the only galaxy in the universe? It's like, I don't know. And then you have Hubble with his signature pipe. He had this telescope, and he would look out, and he would see evidence of these little dots up there. Oh my goodness, that's an entire another galaxy with other stars. And so here's just one example. This is the Andromeda galaxy. This is in 1924. He took this picture, which is still phenomenal for even back then. But this is a more up-to-date version of what that's like. That's the closest galaxy. And fun fact, we're going to run into them supposedly one day, far, 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 far into the future. Or Jesus is going to come back, which is what I think. But anyways, this is James Webb's most recent picture of the Andromeda galaxy, which is a close-up of that little section there. So pretty neat, just kind of showing you how far we've come from 1924 till now. But what Hubble discovered is that the light frequencies that are emitted from these distant stars and galaxies, they change. And so light is essentially, it's stretched out like this. And so he calls this the redshift. He says light's coming from distant galaxies. It's redder than it would be otherwise if they were closer. And this is similar to a concept known as a Doppler shift, which is something that you might not recognize the name, but you'll recognize the sound. It's, an airplane's flying over, and it goes, okay, there's a change in frequency. Okay, and here's an example of the Doppler effect in real time. Okay, you hear that same effect, so that drop in sound, the change in pitch, it's very similar to what we see with the redshift. So when light is stretched throughout the expansion of space, it comes to be redder than what it normally would be. And so Hubble sees this. He sees that light is being stretched. He sees that it seems like the universe is not static as what they had thought before, but rather is expanding. So let's think about this. If the universe is expanding, if it's going this way, if you have a stretchy band, like, one of those workout bands, you ever tried to, do one of these numbers? Okay. If you have one of these and you're stretching it out, what happens if you let go? Okay, it all comes back. So, if you take that same principle, if it's being stretched out, then it must have been able to come back to a finite point. I want to illustrate this here with this balloon video.
You got red galaxies drawn on there, red for the red shift. It's redder than it would otherwise be. Each puff represents going forward in time. Some backwash there. Okay. All right, there we got a universe expanding outward, right? So the discovery of the red shift in the light ends up supporting this new concept of the universe called the expanding universe. It's going outward in time in all directions. But now what happens if you go back in time? Imagine that you're winding the cosmic time scale back. What happens to the universe as you're going backwards? It's getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Can you see that eventually all the matter in the universe, all the stuff out of which those galaxies are made, is going to compress into a single point? And you get to what is in essence a beginning to the expansion.
So through this discovery that Hubble made, we were able to see that in fact there is a beginning, that there was, from a scientific perspective, that there was a point in history's past when everything that is known in the entire universe came to exist. And it's like, well, yeah, you just read Genesis 1:1. Well, we know that, right? But from a scientific perspective, this was remarkable for some, and it was quite scary for others. In fact, there's people who tried to avoid this conclusion, and one of the most notable people was Albert Einstein. He didn't like this idea of the expanding universe because, number one, it messed with the models that he had for relativity, because in his models, the universe is static, and it just is the way it is, and it's not expanding. But on a deeper level, it brought about philosophical implications of, well, there's a beginning. What was the cause of that? Well, it couldn't have been space. It couldn't have been time. It could have been matter, because none of that existed until the point of existence. So what caused it? And so him, like many others, they kind of denied it. But in 1931, in Hubble asked Einstein to come, and so he came, and he saw the observatory, and he looked out and got the information that Hubble was looking at in real time through this telescope, stuff that Einstein had already discovered, but he denied because he didn't like the implications, and he didn't want the implications to mess with his equations. But after seeing this, and there's Hubble in the background with his pipe, of course, and then he says, I now see a necessity for a beginning. And what an astonishing statement to make. He says, I now see the necessity of a beginning. Many people denied this, scientists and philosophers alike. Some were clear in stating that they didn't want this to be, that the universe was expanding because it means that there's a beginning. And if there's a beginning, then that means that something must have caused it. Who caused it? And so we were able to scientifically conclude that there is a singular point in our past that is the beginning of our universe. And so what can that possibly be? Or who can that possibly be? And so I talked about how I think that this is the best argument to use in an evangelistic sense, because you can certainly talk about how, yeah, well, I don't really buy the fine-tuning argument. Okay, I'll give you that. But what about the fact that there's a beginning to the universe? And we have theories now like, okay, well, there's a multiverse, and the universe is constantly expanding and contracting and expanding and contracting and expanding and contracting and expanding and contracting again and again and again into infinity. But all that does is it pushes the problem back further and into a point where you're kind of comfortable with, like, well, it's far enough away, I don't need to answer that question now. But there has to be a beginning. And so what caused it? Well, I would say that it is something that's spaceless, so outside of space. It's something that's timeless, because time was not in existence. It was something that was immaterial, because there was no material at that point. So what is spaceless? What is timeless? And what is immaterial? Who? It's God. It's God. So what I would say if I'm evangelizing someone, I would say, well, there's a beginning, and you have to answer the question of what caused the beginning. Not only that, but okay, there was a cost at the beginning, I'll give you that. Well, and that's where for me personally, I'd take them back to, okay, well, you can agree that there's something, at the very least being agnostic and say there's some higher power. Okay, well, let's take you back to Jesus. Who was Jesus? Who did he claim to be? What did he say? Did he die? Did he rise from the grave? If you want a little bit more information on that, go back a few weeks and see the case for the resurrection. And you point to that, and I think that makes a pretty convincing argument of the existence of God. And not only the existence of God, but the existence that, the confirmation that Jesus was who he said he was, and that is God. The way, the truth, and the life. And there's only one way to the Father, and that's through him. I think we know what can we do with this. I'll conclude with this. Psalm 19:1 says, "The heaven declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork." So I think the best thing that we can do with this is number one, just continue to be, as children. My son asked me all these questions about existence and the universe and life in general, and I feel so ill-equipped to answer them all. But I would encourage you all to be as children, to be curious, to be probing, and ask these questions. Understanding that God has both created nature and revealed the inspired word, and so these two harmonize. They are not at odds with each other. And most of the stuff that they talk about are completely different. But the little overlap, where there is some contention on different beliefs, just understand that Scripture and nature, they have to harmonize, and if there's an issue there, then it is, of course, with our interpretation of it. So I'll leave you with this last verse. It's just a benediction. It says, "Now may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, that you may abound in hope by the power of the Spirit." I think that this stuff is the stuff that gives me maybe not the most hope, but on hard days, it does give me hope. It's like, wow, we're here for a reason. God created all this, and if he can design the universe in such a way that if you changed it one way or the other, it wouldn't be around, it's like, how can he not deal with my problem? Problem X or problem Y, family problem, health problem, whatever it is. And it does give us comfort and hope that if God is the God of the cosmos, he's the God of the everything, then our problems really, when we put it in light of that, it's like they're still there, they're still real, but it does give us hope and it does give us comfort. So that's it. We could do like a 20-part study on the scientific apologetics, and there's some resources. If you're curious about any of the stuff about the anything, I have resources I'd love to recommend to you. But thank you guys for your attentiveness and for your support, and I hope that you were blessed by this. So God bless you.